In 1947, Andy Dufresne, a banker in Maine, is convicted of murdering his wife and her lover, a Gulf bro. He's given 2 life sentences and sent to the notoriously harsh Shawshank prison. Andy always claims his innocence, but his cold, measured demeanor led many to doubt his word. During the first night, the chief guard, Byron Hadley, savagely beats a newly arrived inmate because of his crying and hysterics. The inmate later dies in the infirmary because of the prison doctor had left for the night. Meanwhile, Andy remains steadfast and composed. Ellis Redding, also known as Red, bet against others that Andy would be the one to break first, and loses a considerable amount of cash. About a month later, Andy approaches Red, who runs a contraband inside the wall of Shawshank. He asks if Red could find him a rock hammer, an instrument he claims is necessary for his hobby of rock collecting and sculpting. Though other prisoners consider Andy a really cold fish, Red sees something in Andy. He likes him from the start. Red believes Andy intends to use the rock hammer to engineer his escape in the future, but when the tool arrived, he saw how small it was. Red put aside the thought that Andy could ever use it to dig his way out of prison. Over the first 2 years of his incarceration, Andy works in the prison laundry. He attracts attention from the Sisters, a group of prisoners who sexually assaults other prisoners. Though he persistently resists and fights them, Andy is beaten and raped on a regular basis. Red pulls some strings and get Andy and a few of their mutual friends a break by getting them all on a work detail turning the roof of one of the prison buildings. During the job, Andy overhears Hadley complaining about having to pay taxes for his upcoming inheritance. Using his expertise as a banker, Andy let Hadley know he could shelter the money from the IRS, turning it into a one-time gift for his wife. He said he would assist in exchange for some cold beer for his fellow inmates while on the tarring job. Though at first he threatened to throw Andy off the roof, Hadley, the most powerful guard in prison, agrees, providing the man with cold beer before the job was finished. Red remarks that Andy may have engineered the privilege to build favor with the prison guard as much as he has with his fellow inmates. But Red also thinks Andy simply did it to feel free. While watching a movie, Andy demands Red Rita Hayworth. Soon after asking for Rita Hayworth, Andy once again encountered the Sisters and is brutally beaten, putting him in the infirmary for a month. Bugs, the leader of the Sisters, spent a week in solitary. When he comes out, he finds Hadley and his men waiting in his cell. They beat him so badly, he's left paralyzed, transferred to a prison hospital upstate. The sister never bothered Andy again, and when Andy got out of the infirmary, he finds a bunch of rocks and a poster of Rita Hayworth in his cell. Presents from Red and his buddies. The warden, Sam Norton, hears about Andy helping Hadley and uses a surprise cells inspection to size up Andy. The warden meets with Andy and sends him to work with aging inmate Brooke Hatlin in the prison library, where he sets up a makeshift desk to provide services to other guards, and even the warden himself, with some income tax and other financial services. There, Andy comes upon the opportunity to expand the prison library, starting with asking the state of Maine for funds. He starts writing letters and sends them every week. His financial support practice becomes so appreciated that even the guards from other prisons, when they come for inter-prison baseball matches, sought Andy's financial advice. Andy hires Red as his assistant, and even Norton does his taxes with Andy the following season. Not long after, Brooks, the old librarian, threatens to kill another prisoner, Haywood, in order to avoid being paroled. Andy is able to talk him down, and Brooks is paroled. He goes to a halfway house and finds it impossible to adjust to life outside the prison. He eventually commits suicide. When his friends suggest that he was crazy for doing so, Red tells them that Brooke was obviously become institutionalized, essentially conditioned to be a prisoner for the rest of his life and unable to adjust to the outside world. Red remarks, "At first, you hate these walls, and then you get used to them." After 6 years of writing letters, Andy finally receives $200 from the state for the library, along with collection of old books and records. Though the state senate think this will be enough to get Andy to halt his letter-writing campaign, however, he is undaunted and doubles his effort. When the donation of old books and record arrive at Warden's office, Andy finds a copy of Mozart, The Marriage of Figaro, among the records. He locks the guard assigned to the Warden's office in the bathroom and plays the record on a phonograph over the prison PA system. The entire prison seems captivated by the music. Red remarks that the voice of the woman in the intro made everyone feel free, if only for a brief time. Outside the office, Norton appears furious at the act of defiance and orders Andy to stop the record player. Andy reaches for the needle arm at first, then turns up the volume on the phonograph. The warden orders Hadley to break into the office, and Andy is immediately sent to solitary confinement for 2 weeks. When he gets out, he tells his friends that it was the easiest time stretch ever did in the hole because he had thought of Mozart the entire time. When other prisoners tell him how unlikely that was, he tells them that hope can sustain them. Red is not convinced and leaves, bitter at the thought. With the enlarged library and more material, Andy begins to teach those inmates who wants to receive their high school diploma. After Andy is able to secure a steady stream of funding from various sources, the library is further renovated and named for books. Warden Norton profits on Andy's knowledge of bookkeeping and devises a scheme whereby he puts prison inmates to work on public projects which he won by outbidding other contractors, cheap labor from prisoners. Occasionally he let others get some contract if they bribe him. Andy launders money for the warden by setting up many accounts in different banks along with several investments, using a fake identity by the name of Randall Stefan. He shares this detail with his friend Red, noting that he had to go to prison to become a criminal. In 1965, a young prisoner named Tommy comes to Shawshank. Andy suggests that Tommy takes up another line of work beside theft. The suggestion really gets to Tommy, and he works on achieving his high school equivalency diploma. Even though Tommy is a good student, he is frustrated when he takes up the exam itself, crumpling it up, tossing it to the trash. Andy retrieves it and sends it in. One day, Red tells Tommy about Andy's case. Tommy is visibly upset at hearing Andy's story and tells Andy and Red that he had a cellmate in another prison who boasted about killing a man who was a pro golfer at a country club he worked at. The woman's husband, a banker, had gone to the prison for the murders. With this new information, Andy is full of hope, meets with the warden, expecting that he could help him get another trial with Tommy as a witness. The reaction from warden is completely contrary to what Andy hoped for. Andy says emphatically that he would never reveal the money laundering scheme he had set up for Norton over the years, and the warden becomes furious and orders him to solitary for a month. The warden later meets with Tommy alone and asks him if he could testify on Andy's behalf. Tommy enthusiastically agrees. The warden have him shot dead by Hadley. When the warden visits Andy in solitary, he tells him that Tommy was killed while attempting to escape. Andy tells Norton that the financial scheme will stop. The warden counters, saying that the library will be destroyed and all its material burned. Andy will also lose his private cell and be sent back to the block with the most hardened criminals. The warden gives Andy another month in solitary. Afterwards, Andy returns to the usual life at Shawshank, a seemingly broken man. One day he talks to Red about how although he didn't kill his wife, his personality drove her away, which led to her infidelity and death. He also says if he's ever freed or escapes, he would like to go to Zihuatanejo, a beach town on the Pacific coast of Mexico. He also tells Red how he got engaged. He and his future wife went up to a farm in Baxton, Maine, to a large oak tree at the end of a stone wall. The two made love under the oak tree, after which he proposed to her. He tells Red that if he is ever paroled, he should look up that field and that oak tree. There, under a large volcanic rock that would look out of place, Andy has buried a box that he wants Red to have. Andy refuses to reveal what might be in that box. Later, Andy asks for a length of rope, leading Red and his buddies to suspect he will commit suicide. At the end of the day, Norton asks Andy to shine his shoes for him and put his suit for dry cleaning before retiring for the night. The following morning, Andy is not accounted for as usual from his cell. At the same time, Norton becomes alarmed when he finds Andy's shoes in his box instead of his own. He rushes to Andy's cell and demands an explanation. Hadley brings in Red, but Red insists he knows nothing of Andy's plan. Becoming increasingly hostile and paranoid, Norton starts throwing Andy's sculpted rocks around the cell. When he throws one at Andy's poster of Raquel Welch, the rock punches through and into the wall. Norton tears the poster away from the wall and finds a tunnel just wide enough for a man to crawl through. During their previous night's thunderstorm, Andy wore Norton's shoes to his cell, catching a lucky break when no one notices. He packed some papers and Norton clothing into a plastic bag, tied it to himself with the rope he had asked for, and escaped through his hole. The tunnel he had excavated led him to a space between two walls of the prison, where he found the main sewage line. Using a rock, he hits it in time with the lightning strikes and eventually burst it. Crawling through 500 yards in the main pipe through the raw sewage, Andy emerged in the broke side of the wall. A search team later finds his uniform and a small rock hammer, which he had worn nearly to nothing. That morning, Andy walks into Maine National Bank in Portland, where he had put Warden Norton's money. Using his assumed identity as Randall Stephans with all the necessary documentation, he walked out with a cashier's check. Before he leaves, he asks them to drop a package in the mail. He continues his visitation nearby a dozen other local banks, ending up with $370,000. The package contained Warden Norton account books, which were delivered straight to the Portland Daily Bugle newspaper. Not long after, the police storms the Shawshank prison. Hadley's arrested for murder. Red said he was taken away, crying like a little girl. Warden finally opens his safe, which he hadn't touched since Andy escaped, and instead of his book, he finds the Bible he had given to Andy. Norton opens it to the book of Exodus and finds that the pages have been cut out in the shape of Andy's rock hammer. Norton walked back to his desk as the police pound on his door, takes out a small revolver, and shoot himself under the chin. Red remarked that he wondered if Warden thought right before pulling the trigger how Andy could ever get the best of him. Shortly after, Red receives a postcard from Fort Hancock, Texas, with nothing written on it. Red takes it as a sign that Andy had made it to Mexico, to freedom. Red and his buddies would spend their time talking about Andy's exploit, but Red just misses his friend. At Red's next parole hearing in 1967, he talked to the parole board about the word rehabilitated and how it was a made-up word, how he regretted his action of the past. His parole is granted this time. He goes to work at the grocery store and stays in the same halfway house, same room, as Brooke had stayed in. He frequently walked by a pawn shop which had several guns and compasses in the window. At times, he contemplates trying to go back to prison, but he remembered the promise he had made to Andy. One day, with a compass he bought from the pawn shop, he follows Andy's instruction, hitchhiking to Baxton, and arriving at the stone wall Andy had described. Just like Andy said, there was a large black stone. Under it, it was a small box containing a large sum of cash, and instruction to find him. He said he needed somebody who could get things done for a project of his. Red violates his parole and leaves the halfway house, unconcerned since no one would really do an extensive manhunt for an old crook like him. He takes a bus to Fort Hancock, where he crosses into Mexico. The two friends are finally reunited on the beach of Zihuatanejo on the Pacific coast.